Hi, Sherrette.
Well, hey,
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you, friend?
I'm good. I'm good.
I have to say, it's kind of weird, like, because we talk 875 times a day,
Yeah, we do.
but we never have a conversation synchronously. It's usually text or Marco Polo.
Right. We do.
So
No, you call now. You can
that's
hold
true.
on. Let's give you the credit. You call now.
That's true. We
Yeah.
FaceTime when I go pick up my kid. That's true.
Right.
That's true.
Right.
Yeah.
So we know how to have a synchronous conversation. I think what's kind of awkward is like, how do you get into the flow of the
I
podcast?
know.
You
I know.
know?
And I got a microphone in front of me.
Right. It's a little weird.
It's
It's a little
weird.
weird. Yeah.
It's
But
weird. We're
like
gonna do
we
it though.
talk. We're gonna be okay. We
Yeah.
talk. We
Yeah.
talk, but and
Um,
honestly, I just want to get your perspective on, like, how do you think the podcast is going, or like, what are some important things that you noticed about the podcast?
yeah. So I have been Team Keisha for a while now, right? And you
Yeah,
and I have been talking about launching this podcast for the better part of what, a year?
yeah, too long. Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, it's super scary, it's super vulnerable. And like what I think is amazing is is like the intent of trying to make it accessible for an audience like me,
Right.
right? So we have talked a lot about my own journey and like learning how to be an anti-racist and
Hmm.
aspiring to be an ally and all of those things. And um, they're really like, there's a lot of conversations about it, but sometimes it feels really inaccessible to me.
Yeah.
And so I feel like since you and I talk so much about it, you've really made it accessible for me, which is what I see you doing in this podcast. And so things
Yeah.
like, so when I started, even acknowledging that I was racist and like I had a lot of shit that I needed to clean up,
Sure.
it felt super overwhelming,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Like for me, it felt I'm born and raised in the South.
Hmm.
Like we are real conditioned to martyr ourselves at the expense of everybody else, right?
Sure.
And so when I started learning about racism, even though it was completely ingrained in me, but when I started learning about it and learning how I participate in it, it was really, really overwhelming because it went against everything I was conditioned to do, which is make sure that everyone else is comfortable,
Hmm.
even at the
Hmm.
expense of
Hmm.
myself. Right.
Right.
But you have shifted that in a big way for me in respect of like, yeah, like you it's yeah, you're racist, but you're just white. You say
Right.
that to me a lot. You say
Right.
it's not that you're a bad person, you're
Right.
just white.
You're just
And
white.
you often say like, white people.
Right.
And
Right.
at first, when you first started saying that kind of language to me, I went to where I always go, which is like, white people do things that are wrong. Like it's very much a binary right and wrong. But what I've sort of gotten to, like the place that I've gotten to is like, oh, like you poor thing, you just can't help it. Like
Right.
it's
Right.
so it's so ingrained in you, you just don't know any better.
Right. Bless your
And
heart.
so now I can think about like my
Yeah.
kid, right? Like my kid
Right.
is 3 and like
Yeah.
she is learning about the world and like there's a lot of grace that's given to her because she's supposed to,
Right.
right? And so it felt very much like, oh, here's the grace that you need to be able to just learn about this really complicated thing that you didn't know that you did.
Right. What I like about having the conversations with you is like, I don't know that what I'm sharing with you is inaccessible. Right. So, like, it's because we can have this like back and forth conversation that I'm like, oh, like white people don't actually know this. But I also
Mhm.
feel in the same way that you like say, oh, no, no, let me explain to you about white women and how we kind of function and how we think about things and how we
Yeah.
need, like this right or wrong. Like I get so much insight because of the thing. So I think these conversations are like a shared benefit, right? And
Yeah.
allow us to have a more robust conversation because like there's a back and forth.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I've been learning about this for several years now. And so I but I can really remember that feeling of like that shutdown feeling that I would often have. And let's be honest, sometimes still have, like when it feels like it gets to be like the words that I like to use, like it feels too hot to touch, like I'm too close to the fire. It
Yeah,
feels
yeah, yeah.
too painful, right? And so my MO is to retreat and shut down and be like, I can't process this. And but what I know is like that is bad, quote unquote. Like that is not the action that you're supposed to do. If you're on an anti-racist journey, you're supposed to lean into the fire. You're supposed to like it's supposed to hurt and you're supposed to keep taking like the heat, right? And and sometimes like that has been just not possible for me. So then I feel bad that I do the thing, and then I feel bad that I can't stay in the conversation and take the heat, right? So it's like a double whammy sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think what I have really appreciated about our back and forth is like you've often given me the door, which I do want to say, because here I go, like here's where I get myself in trouble. Like
Yeah.
I understand that that's extra labor for you.
Sure. Yeah.
Like that you have to give me the passes, that you have to give me the
Right.
door to make it a little bit easier for me to take the heat.
Right.
And so I have a lot of complicated feelings about it.
Sure, sure, sure. But I also think it's unfair to say just because this is an anti-racist journey that you have to therefore push through. Like nothing happens like that. Like no, there is no level of growth that happens like in this kind of like I must do everything right all the time. And when it gets too hot, when it gets too hard, I got to keep going. Like people take breaks, right? Like when you
Mm-hmm.
are running a marathon, right? You stop and you get water, right? Sometimes you stop and stretch, right? But
Yeah.
you keep going. And I think the important thing is something I mentioned in the first actual episode was about recovery. Like, how are you recovering? Sure, the fire's going to get hot. You're going to touch it. You're going to get burned, and quite frankly, that's what you get. But how are you recovering, right? Like, how do you recover? That's not a bad thing. Like understanding that like this journey is hard and doing this
Mm-hmm.
is hard. And I appreciate like your consideration for the amount of labor it is for me. And I think you just have to recognize that there are some people who are willing to do this labor with you, and there's some people who are not. And like in
Yes.
those cases, like you have to learn to adjust and adapt.
Right.
But like so I think that's the human experience, and there's grace for that. And also, like, what are you doing to like how do you stay in the conversation when it does get like how do you come back, right? Because I don't want you to just stay.
Mm-hmm.
Like take a breath. And what happens is people take that breath and they never come back. They
Yeah, it's
never
hard to
come
come
back.
back.
Yeah, it's
It's
hard
hard
to
to
get
come
back.
back. Yeah, yeah. I think, but it is such a lesson for me to think about recovery.
Sure.
And like, because to me, that's so fundamental. If I can understand how I, Sherrette, need to recover,
Mm-hmm.
then it doesn't matter what the the barrier or what the hiccup was or what the misstep was, because I have fundamentally got clear on how I recover.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so I think that that episode was really, really important. And I hope that people who are really interested in committing onto this journey spend some time there. Like
Sure.
get real clear on how you recover,
Yeah.
because you're going to have to do it a lot. The other thing that I was a big lesson for me and how I stay in the conversation is like white women love to know what the parameters are and they love to know the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And and this, I think this, maybe this is a little bit too like of a stereotype, but this is the reason why anti-racist work is so hard, is because it's not a game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there really are no rules,
Right.
right? Because how I interact with you is going to be different than how I interact with somebody else that's a black or brown person, right? So
Sure.
so white women really love to know what the parameters are and what the rules are, and they have operated in the game of white supremacy for so long that they are real clear on how to play this game. They're
Right.
real clear on the rules and they stay confined in those spaces very, very well. And so now you're completely out of the game of white supremacy. Well, you're still operating in it, but you're in a whole different realm where the
Right.
rules are sort of like not clear to
Right.
us. And
Right.
so that's a very scary place. But what I have, again, like a fundamental pillar for me is the recovery part and the relationship.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm focused on my relationship with Keisha as my friend.
Sure.
And so what that looks like and what I'm willing to ask from you, the extra labor that I'm willing to ask from you
Mhm.
is simply based on the relationship that you and I have.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so I think the mistakes that I made in the past were, but Keisha's willing to give me that labor.
sure, sure.
Why isn't so and so willing to give me that labor?
Right, right.
And I think that's a mistake that I and probably a lot of white women make.
Right. And I think, well, there's two things I want to say. The first thing I want to say is I really appreciate what you said about white women and understanding parameters and rules. And I think that kind of piggybacks off or feeds into the episode about the interpreter archetype, right? And
Mm,
how we experience the weaponization of the rules.
yes.
Because it's like, these are the parameters. Somebody said we have to wear closed-toe shoes at a platform job.
Right.
Like, we have to do it and you didn't do it. So let me just
Right.
destroy you, right, on social
That's right.
media, right? It's because those rules are set, and I think a lot of time there are so many people who feel secure in following the rules and they feel insecure otherwise, right? Because language is complicated, deaf people are complicated, so like I've got to grab onto something to anchor me, and the rules are it, right? And then as a result of that, it becomes very dehumanizing to who you're inflicting these rules on and why the rules were there in the first place, right? So that's the first thing I want to
Yeah.
say. The second thing I want to say is um I'm probably setting a bad precedent, right? Because I'm spoiling
Mm.
you with my willingness to do the work. I do think it's a part of friendship, right? So we are in relationship, we do life together, right? And
Yeah.
so that makes sense to me that I would do this labor with you. And I don't think it's fair to expect it of anybody else
Right.
ever. Right. And so there may be moments. I mean, we haven't reached a moment where I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do this today. But there may be
Yeah.
moments that I might decide to do that. And that's okay too. And
Mhm.
so as long as you're aware and
Mhm.
stay in a kind of empathetic place and a place of gratitude, you recognize this is a gift. Right. And not that I'm that special, but I am. I'm amazing, period.
You are. I know.
But I'm just saying, like, it's a hard thing. And I think even in the podcast, I'm spoiling the audience in the sense that I am doing this work. I'm like, say, hey, come do this work with me. Right. And
Mhm.
and it is a kind of bad precedent. Like, don't expect this of anybody else. Don't expect the whole,
Mhm.
anti-shame framework from anybody else. Don't
Right.
expect grace from anybody else. Like,
Right.
um, it is a fair place to be in a completely opposing side than Keisha. And I
Right.
think, that's something that people need to know.
Yeah, and I think that there's so much there, right? Because I think that white women are used to being guaranteed grace.
Yeah.
Like we get a lot of forgiveness just in the world of white supremacy and knowing the rules, right? So eh, going from that to a place of like nobody owes you anything. And in
Exactly.
fact, like you've been pretty fucked up. You and all your people have been really, really fucked up. So like to ask us to give you grace is an enormous and impossible ask. And so to that like that binary feeling of like I get all the grace and all the passes and I get to do pretty much whatever I want in the game of white supremacy. And then here it's like kind of like open up this door and you don't know what you're going to get behind each door is a very scary place to be when you've always
Mhm.
operated in the former. Um, and I think this is how you get to the but I have a black friend
Ooh,
kind
yes.
of trope,
Right. Right.
right? Because some white lady has a black friend who has given them the labor and who
Sure.
has given them the passes, and they're like, "Oh,
Mhm.
okay, now I know how the game is.
Mhm.
This feels familiar. I know how to keep myself safe in this place." And then they go to another black person and they're like, "I don't understand, but I have a black friend and they give me all these passes and they give me all this labor."
Right.
And so I think that like those are the two things, like the two fundamental things. I'm sure there's many more, but like that's what comes to mind for me is recovery, getting real clear on how I recover and understanding the value of relationships and how they're all
Mhm.
different. And I cannot do like a plug and play, like it's not a copy and paste situation.
No. I also think like there's such a huge push in the country in terms of like CRT and book banning and all these kind of complicated political things
Mhm.
that prioritizes the comfort of white people, right? And so like
Absolutely.
if you are looking for if you're looking to be comfortable, then you lean into, oh, I have a Black friend, right? Like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
not bad because I have this thing, or oh,
Yeah.
Keisha's willing to do the work, so I'm okay, right? And instead of staying in the discomfort, right? Because if you prioritize comfort, then you never learn the process of recovery. Because when
Right.
you're upended, then you kind of fall apart. But if you learn how to like fall apart because I've made a mistake, I represent mistakes, right?
Mhm.
Then then you don't recover well, right? And so I think that's part of the journey is like you got to embrace the discomfort. Like no
Mhm.
growth happens in a comfort zone. It's not a thing. Like that the comfort zone is where you atrophy, right?
Right.
But when you're uncomfortable and you stretch and you push and you grow, that's when you can do really good work and be more productive and actually be an ally, right?
I think like what has to be acknowledged is that there's a level of maturity that hasn't been reached in the conversation of anti-racism, even anti-autism within the white interpreter collective, right?
Sure.
So like again, I use my kid often as an example when we talk. Like right now, Bo is trying to figure out what is funny. So she will do silly things like she'll put, a piece of paper on her head and she goes, "Is this funny?" And so it's either funny or it's not, right? The same thing with like bad and good. Like she's like, "That's okay. Is that bad? Is this
Mm-hmm.
good?" Like for her, it's
Mm-hmm.
very binary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because that's just where she is as a 3-year-old, and she's eventually going to understand that there are a lot of shades to this rainbow, right? Like there's a lot of things where this could be good, but also bad, or this could be bad, but also good, or it depends on who's doing it, or it depends on who's experiencing it. But
Sure.
this is where she is. And
Yeah.
that's where white interpreters are right now. It's either I do X, Y, and Z, and I'm a good white interpreter,
Yeah.
or I'm bad. And so that's when you talk about the interpreter archetype and you talk about how there's like these like rule warriors who like seek out the
Yeah.
people who are doing wrong. It's because they haven't reached a level of maturity
Mm.
that there are different shades to this rainbow.
Yeah, that's good.
It's more than
Yeah.
open-toed shoes are bad on a stage,
Yeah.
polka dotted skirts is a, colossal sin.
Right.
It's who's wearing it, who's the audience, what's the relationship?
Right. Right. And then I think also it's like, what's the impact on the deaf person? Because there's
Right.
so often these hearing interpreters want to champion for deaf people who aren't complaining, right? They don't have an issue. This is your issue. So it's
Yeah.
like cool your jets. Go sit down somewhere,
Right.
right? This is not about you. And it becomes too personal. They want to we make everything about us.
Yeah.
And it's not about us. And like, yeah,
It's really hard, I think, for interpreters to separate that because this is a performance type of work, right? You are very much evaluated by the use of your body, the actual
sure,
physical use of your body and your
sure,
brain.
sure,
And
sure.
so it's really hard for interpreters to understand. And like we talk about it all the time, we've been talking about it for years. How do you separate yourself from the work? And yes, that is absolutely where we should be going. But again, like we haven't reached a level of maturity to be able to do that. And it's really difficult when you're using your body to do the work.
Right. Right. But here's the thing though, when you don't make the separation, then you situate yourself more in oppressive places, right? And not
Of
just
course.
for your co-interpreters or your colleagues, but also for deaf
Yeah,
people, right? And I
absolutely.
think it's important to understand that we are in positions of power as hearing people. Like we
Absolutely.
have so much power and so much authority that we do oppress deaf people. And I think even like fighting on their behalf is oppressive. Like
Absolutely.
how are you functioning as poor deaf people? Oh, they can't defend themselves. I'll take it from here. Like that's
Hmm.
completely problematic. And so if you're doing this to deaf people, you're also doing this to Black and brown people. You're also
Hmm.
doing this to people of different sexual preferences and gender identities. Like there's
Hmm.
just oppression everywhere, right? And so like you're becoming an expert oppressor when that's not your job and that's not who you're supposed to
Hmm.
be, and it makes your work ineffective.
That's a really interesting point about how, like, it makes me think of how we have gotten somewhat good at separating ourselves from the work when we're talking about the things that need to be attended to in our work. Like we need
Yeah.
to look at our processing time. We need to look at our production, whatever. But the second we're doing something right, all of a sudden that separation is not there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like when we were doing all the quote unquote right things, then our work is not separated from ourselves because
Mm-hmm.
we also own the right. We
Right.
are responsible for the right. We did the good things. We're a good interpreter. We're highly skilled, blah, blah, blah. And like that becomes a personal thing that we wear,
Right. Right. And that's just why
which
you
is
get so
which is
much shame.
problematic.
Right. It's where
Yeah.
you get all the shame from, is
Yeah.
because I am involved. I am the work. I don't make the separation. And then I'm either good or I'm bad. Right. And so,
Right.
and if I'm good, that means I don't say no to work. Even if I have done the process and realize I am not a good fit because culturally I don't, my skin doesn't match, but it's the Lion King. I got it. Right. I've been
Oh
doing
God.
performances for a long period of time. I got it. Like I'm good. I can do this work. It doesn't matter that no one else in the room looks like me, but I got it. Right. And so you develop that kind of like entitlement that I'm supposed to be there because of this whole mindset that I am good. Right. And
Yeah.
it's it's problematic, man. It's like so
Yeah.
terrible and it's pervasive.
It is, and it's only one directional, right? So
Sure.
like let's say in your Q&A you talk about like when white interpreters can stay or leave these black spaces, and you talk about how yeah, like somebody could have been raised in black spaces and they may be able to access the nuances that most white interpreters can't. Sure. All of those things could be true, but that is completely irrespective of the fact that you haven't even considered your audience, right?
Right.
Like, can your audience even look at a white body and understand what like just the white skin being the barrier itself,
Sure.
right? Like I think about like if we use a different example, like uh, let's say you get called to a hospital, and this is so I should say this is a trigger warning,
Okay.
but this is what comes to mind as an egregious example that we may be able to access. Let's say you get called to a hospital and you're working with a sane nurse who is working with the sexual assault survivor.
Sure.
And if that person was sexually assaulted by someone in a male body, we all understand that if a man went into that space, that probably would be incredibly triggering. And it would be really difficult for that person to be able to access the message, regardless of how accurate or clear this person is.
Oh, that's
We
good.
seem to understand that,
Yep.
right? We got that. That makes sense. But for some reason, we have a hard time understanding why Keith Wan should not be interpreting in this space,
Right.
even though he's married to a person of color, even though he may think that he can access the nuances in the language and all of that and all of that and all of that, it has not even considered the deaf person in the audience. It hasn't considered the hearing person in the audience who's like, I see this white skin glowing over here in the corner and I can't not look at it. And it feels like a detractor to this very expensive performance that I paid good money to come and see.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like
But
it just, it's only one directional.
yeah, I also appreciate that example, but just to add a different example is like when we think about deaf kids and who they're being educated by, one of the big proponents is like deaf kids should have deaf teachers, right? So they have the good role models, they have good language models, they can see that deaf people can be successful, right? Like
Yes.
if that's an idea that makes sense to people, then it's
Mm-hmm.
like, why you
Yeah.
all why you not following
Yeah.
the reasoning behind not only the fact that Keith Wan wasn't a good fit, but he sued. Like
He got mad that he wasn't a good fit.
he got mad. Like you knew you weren't a good fit. You got mad that they told you to, and like I get that you're not supposed to say it. I get it. Like you got mad that they told you something you already knew, and you decided to throw a hissy fit.
Yeah.
Like we kind of have to, we got to be better than that because it's not about us. It really isn't about us. And Keith made that
Yeah.
all about him. It's about the people who need to see themselves represented on the stage. It's about the qualified Black and brown interpreters who could have done that work, right?
Right.
There's not a shortage of that. It's about like, why would I get this white guy who does have all this experience, but is not a skin match, who doesn't have that representation? Like there's no need to negotiate down qualities
Mm-hmm.
and characteristics of an interpreter when you can find interpreters who have those qualities and characteristics. Like
Yeah.
that's a thing. And I think people are having a hard time with that because that was one of the questions. It's like, well, maybe, I mean, he could have, and it's like, right, why are we even thinking about this? And
Right.
it's a question that I think white people think about
Uh-huh.
because you don't have that shortage. You have your representation. You have people who look like you in these spaces. Excuse me, in these
Hmm.
spaces. This is a norm for you. So of course you don't get why uh, black and brown people might need that.
And I would give a white interpreter that quote unquote pass. They don't understand what it feels like. But Keith Wan is a CODA. I don't know what his position is on the CODA movie, but I can speak personally. I am a CODA, and I really, really struggled with the fact that the lead character is not a CODA.
Sure, yeah.
Right. And I get that, limited pool, all of that kind of stuff. But I had a really hard time connecting with the movie because all I could see was disfluency that didn't align with it. Look, codas are disfluent. Like,
Sure,
yes,
sure,
there's a wide range of language with codas, but the errors that she made were not the same type of errors that a coda would make in their
sure.
disfluency. And so I could not see past it. I
Yeah,
couldn't see past it,
that's
even though she's
good.
a wonderful actress, even though she sings incredibly. The movie, the storyline, I loved all of it. Like they found a journal that I wrote and made that into a movie. Like this was my
Wow,
story.
that's
And it was
good.
wildly impactful, but I couldn't get past the sheer fact that she represented something that wasn't me and was trying to wear an identity that wasn't hers.
Ooh, and it's harmful. It's so harmful and painful. Like I'm listening to you talk about it. I'm like, dang, like I had never even considered that. And right, right,
Yeah.
right.
And to your point, like we may not fully understand the experience of a black or brown person, but
Hmm.
we could probably understand pain. We could probably understand what it feels like to be not represented. Like we can find examples if we're willing to look. I think there's danger in that, right?
Sure.
Like I think that there's absolute danger where, and white people do this, right? Like, oh, well, I understand your experience because I'm Jewish. I understand your experience because I'm a woman, right? And there's a lot of danger in doing that, right? Because it is not the same experience. But I do think that that could be at least a jumping off point to say, yes, you don't know my specific experience, but you know pain.
Hmm.
You know what that feels like. And so why do you want to contribute to my pain?
Hmm. Right. But I think it's also important that we see the perspective and trying to understand the perspectives and experiences of other people without comparison. Right.
Yeah.
That's where we get into the dangerous, like,
Yes.
oh, this is the same as this, and it's
Right.
not.
Right.
But I think I have to think outside of myself in order to be a good ally and in order to be a good anti-autist, like I have to think outside of myself and try and understand the worldview and perspectives and lived experiences of other people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I also loved the episode about the anti-autist archetype.
You mean the interpreter archetype?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought it was a really great episode. And it makes me wonder, do you think that there are other archetypes other than just this one?
So I think you probably have more insight than I do, but because I mean I talked about what I've seen, and I talked about some of the ways that the archetype is problematic,
Mhm.
but I don't necessarily fully see the full gamut. And I think as a coda you might see have different perspective. As a white woman, you probably have different perspectives. But so I'm interested. What you got?
Yeah, my gut, I don't like I haven't really spent very much time thinking about it, but my gut is that there's probably several hearing interpreter archetypes. I think that there's a coda archetype. I think there's probably a deaf archetype. And I think
Oh, that's
the
good.
other, I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole, but I do think that there is one. And I think what's really important to talk about or to consider is that there are these archetypes, right? And there's also the archetype that I'm viewed as, and that may not be necessarily the archetype that I feel like I align with,
That's good.
right? So, like,
That's
for
good.
example, like let's talk about a stereotype of codas, and that could be like the basis of a coda archetype, right? So, like we Probably were raised in community.
Mm-hmm.
We used sign language as our primary language, right? So we have a lot of ownership for this language, and we didn't go to a professionally trained program to
Right.
become an interpreter.
Right.
We also probably wear a lot of similarities as the deaf archetype, whatever that might look like.
Sure.
But so I may be the CODA archetype, but I may be viewed as the hearing interpreter archetype from a deaf lens, right? And so they may view and assume that I'm coming in with a white savior raised in a church and what that means and what that looks like.
Yeah.
But I may not be the archetype that they view me as.
Right.
Or they know that I'm a CODA and they're viewing me through the CODA archetype, but I'm not exactly that.
That's good.
Right. Like, so if you're using the stereotypes of CODAs, they're not professionally trained, they're not certified, they have no boundaries,
Ooh, that's
they're
good.
not
Yeah.
professional, like all
Yeah.
of those like stereotypes that we get labeled. And I
Uh-huh.
show up and they're like, okay, I can tell that you're a CODA, or like, I know who you are, you're whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to expect for me to act accordingly,
Sure.
good, bad, or otherwise.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, but that's not me,
That's not you. Yeah. Yeah. I think I also experienced that. Like, I don't know, but I show up to jobs sometimes and I'll be with my team and I think they expect me to fit that black church interpreter archetype, right? Like they don't
Yeah.
expect me to have any skill at all. They're like, oh, she lackadaisical, she ain't
Mhm.
friendly, she, whatever the case may be. And like I also don't fit that either.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should keep talking about this. This is a great conversation. Like
Yeah. I
what
think
are
this is
all
going to
the
be,
archetypes?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I was sort of like trying to like wrap my head around like the archetype thing, because we've heard some of them. We've heard about the helper archetype,
Yep.
but I think you brought in a new one, this like anti-autist, right? And like
Right.
they're the rule warrior. They're the one that's going to be, demolishing you on realities of interpreting or whatever that
Yeah.
Facebook page is, and
Yeah.
reading you the riot act because you wore a patterned skirt on a stage.
Yeah.
So but that's a new archetype that we haven't really talked about,
Yeah.
right? We've talked about the helper, we've talked about the god I the rope the robot model. No, what's that called?
Yeah.
I forgot.
Yeah.
The old school anyway. But
Conduit.
this
Conduit.
is a
You're talking about
conduit.
conduit.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
conduit model. Right. So we've talked about these models of interpreting, and really we're talking about interpreter archetypes.
Right. We're that
And you've
exactly.
brought in a new one.
Yeah.
And this is a new one that we haven't really talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we should talk about it and then also find ways to figure out how do we improve the archetype. Like I don't want to fit into that
Mhm.
box anyway. Like I don't fit in that box, but I definitely don't want to. And in the box that I do fit better in, I still don't want to fit in that either. Like I was never made for a box. Box are made for stuff, not
Shoes.
people. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Shoes
So
and chocolate. That's what goes in
juice and
boxes.
chocolate, that part, right? And that ain't Keisha, and that's not Sherrette either. So yeah, let's
No, I mean, and
talk about that.
truth be told, it's not anybody.
Yeah, yeah,
It's not anybody. So, but I think it's important to talk about what the benefit of understanding what an interpreter archetype is.
yeah, yeah.
Like, because essentially, I think it can be misconstrued that you're suggesting we put people in boxes, and that's not what I think you're
Right.
trying to suggest.
No, 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 absolutely not. I think the issue is that some people put themselves in boxes. Like
Uh-huh.
these are the rules. I must follow them to a T. Right? Tell me what to do. And when that doesn't work, then it's like
Mm-hmm.
people don't know. People are very uncomfortable with that, and as a result, I think they become more oppressive and more problematic. And I
Yeah.
think it's also the same thing that we see, and I think I've mentioned this in one of the episodes. Is the same thing we see newer interpreters do. It's like we put our interpretations in a box. We like, oh, this is the sign for this word, and it's like, hey, who's your client? Like, how
Mm-hmm.
do they understand language? How do they use language? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And making sure that there are sometimes that we provide a robust, ASL interpretation, lots of depiction, and sometimes do you watch TV?
Finger spell it.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? We have to start
Yeah.
to a question. We have to start from a question and ask another question, to ask another question to develop the interpretation in conjunction with the
Yeah.
deaf person, depending on their background and where they're from. And then there are lots of things. So we can't put anything in a box. And I think boxes are safe for people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I look forward to more conversations about that.
absolutely. Let's do it.
Thanks, friend.
All right. Thanks, Fran. I'll see you next
Good
time.
talking to you today. Yeah.
All right.